Well, we are in our last chapter. It's the third call to discipleship, chapter 25. Of course, next week we'll start with signs and wonders. So, start moving here. The chapter begins with the authors talking about the first half of the gospel with a question. Anybody know what the question is? You'd have to remember back to an earlier chapter. This quote won't tell you the question, by the way.
But there's a question in it.
Okay, let's read through this. I'll read this one, then after this, I'm going to call on some other people.
We don't have our British friend anymore?
No, well, I didn't have time.
Oh,
I didn't. I was trying to corral him to narrate for us, and I just couldn't connect. So the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test him, to ask him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply, and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back in the boat, crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." What's the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod? What's yeast to begin with?
It makes things rise.
Okay, makes things rise. So what would be the yeast of the Pharisees? What would make the Pharisee rise?
Anything that goes against.
Well, that's one possibility.
I would guess their ideology.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the yeast is what makes bread bread.
Right.
So the yeast of the Pharisees would be what makes a Pharisee a Pharisee.
Which would be?
Well, Jesus' interpretation, I think, would be their view of the world, and particularly of the religious world.
Okay. And probably specifically
their paradigm might be a good word.
All the rules. So the yeast of the Pharisees is that they follow all the guidelines, all the rules, and if they're perfect, they rise, they become, spiritual. And what's the yeast of Herod? What makes Herod rise? Power. Yeah. So the yeast of the Pharisees can be understood as self-righteousness, the strict adherence to the law, and Herod is power. He loved his position over the people. And so just as yeast permeates the ingredients that affect bread making, the Pharisees and Herod were creating laws that were overbearing and ungodly, which could permeate the spiritual people of God. That's a quote from the author. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, beware of what? Two things: self-righteousness and power. Yeah. And remember, we've gone through the whole thing where the disciples, they want to know who's going to sit on the right hand of Jesus. So the power issue there. They want to know what rules to follow. Saying, knocks down to two commandments or two. So here's the rest of it. That scripture. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? You still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? You have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" So the big question that the authors are posing for us is, do we have eyes to see and we fail to see? Do we have ears to hear and yet we still hear and we still don't understand? So Mark is is asking us those questions. Do we see all these things that happen in the life of Jesus? Do we truly understand? So, in essence, are your hearts hardened? You have eyes that fail to see, ears that fail to hear. And I like the bread gum. So, the yeast of self-righteousness is the Pharisees. It's just yeast of the Herodians. Those are the two things Jesus is suggesting his disciples be aware of. Any comments? Say anything to you today?
I don't know. I always wonder, I can hear Amy Jo Levine talking about this, and how much would she say this is Mark speaking, and how much of it is Jesus speaking? Because, as she points out in some of the books we've read, a lot of what the Gospels have that are negative toward the Pharisees and the Jews is the product of the authors more so than Jesus, because of the time in which they were written and the conditions under which they were written. I can't read anything anymore without her voice.
Well, we'll hear
In
some
my
more
head.
starting next week. So, the other thing it does is we also have to be aware of the author of our book from the study, because what's their emphasis? Justice, social justice. Okay. So much of what they are pointing out when they go back and talk about do you have eyes that fail to see and ears that fail to hear, what they're really saying to today's Christian is, are you looking around and ignoring all the injustice in the world and simply enjoying a safe faith? I think that's what they would say. Now, is that a good bias? I think probably so, but it is still a bias.
Mhm.
So now the lesson begins. This is dealing with the aftermath of crucifixion. And start with Mark 15. Anybody have a voice better than mine to read this one? Go ahead, start.
Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. And when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?
Okay, so who's there? Who are the women who are there?
The people that love Jesus, Mary,
Okay,
who was a disciple,
specifically name them.
Mary Magdalene, which I didn't know that they actually knew it was her. Mary's mother of James and Salome.
Well, first it says Mary, the mother of Joseph, and then James. So is it two different Marys?
Yeah,
Good question.
they're all mixed up.
And who is the mother of Joseph? We always assume it was Mary, the mother of Jesus, I think.
Well,
It's one of the
some
women.
versions say the mother of Joseph, and some say the mother of Joseph. It's interchangeable.
Joseph's brother.
And so, just to complicate things more,
You get another one.
here's at the crucifixion. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph, and Salome.
Okay, so it was Mary, mother of both James and Joseph.
Yeah.
And Salome,
then-
who do we know who she is?
Well, then the authors say that the Mary there is the mother of Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's some dispute because in Mark, it talks about Mary's son. Said the crowd at the temple is saying, isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Well, so the authors interpret that as being that James and Joseph are brothers of Jesus. And other scholars say, no, the term brother often was referring to a cousin because the family was so intertwined that you can't tell. I mean, and then you get into a whole issue, which we're not going to debate unless you want to, about whether Mary had other children. Mark is used as a basis for saying, yeah, she had other children. Others say those are cousins, not brothers and sisters. So the bottom line is, we have three Marys at the crucifixion and at the tomb, and it is not real clear which three they are, because there are references to Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Jacob, mother of James the Lesser, and Mary of Clopas, sometimes identified as the Mary of Jacob, and then of course Mary of Bethany, who's not associated with crucifixion. And just to make things even more complicated, some versions, Salome is referred to as Mary Salome.
And then I found one named Joanna.
Okay.
And the other Salome in the New Testament was the daughter of Herodias, who was the one that demanded the head of John the Baptist. So that is very confusing.
Well, could it be, okay, this one says Mary, mother of Jesus, widow of Joseph.
Mary of Clopas is oftentimes referred to as the sister-in-law of Mary, that she was the sister of Joseph, who married Mary. So all I'm trying to tell you is it's very confusing, and I'm not sure anybody has an exact answer to it. But there were three. This is a painting, and there are multiple paintings and sculptures depicting the three Marys at the tomb and at the crucifixion, and who they are specifically hard to tell. And I've seen a couple notes by scholars saying that Mary was one of the most common names in that time period. So
Make that more interesting, that picture, they all look like nuns, don't they?
yeah. Well, I'm sure they were sainted, you know.
Yeah.
Solomon, did you say this already? Was the mother of James and John?
Say it again.
Salome was the mother of James and John. Did you guys say that? I was reading.
James and John, that's sons of
It was.
Yeah.
It does. I don't think it refers to when they. Let's go back. I think that the reference here is that there's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome.
Salome's, yeah, and she was the mother of James and John, is what this said.
Okay, well, then there's a Mary who has a son James, and another Mary who has a son James. I mean, if it's Mary Salome,
Well,
two
they
Marys
said
there, both with sons by the name of James.
Jesus' mother had James, a Joseph, a Simon, and possibly a Judas/Jude.
One of the other interpretations is that Mary, the mother of James becomes the head of the Jerusalem church, and was considered the brother of Jesus.
And James the younger.
And so one of the interpretations is, jump ahead here, that the reason that Mary was not identified at the tomb as the mother of Mary is because of this mark, quote, basically where Jesus is told mother and brothers are outside and saying, who's my mother, who's my brothers? And for that reason, she's not identified as his mother. I'm not sure I understand the logic of that, but that's at least one of the arguments.
Here's another question that I would have. They're in Jerusalem, and Jesus and all of his travels with the disciples was just the men. So how would the women know to go to Jerusalem? I mean, unless they went for Passover, I guess. If they found out Jesus had been crucified, somebody would have had to take that message all the way back up to Galilee, to Nazareth, and tell them, and they would have had to quickly come down to Jerusalem.
I think
in the movie, in the show Chosen, there were women traveling with the group.
Yeah. But I mean, you think about all the times that they were out in the boat and crossing the Sea of Galilee and stuff. I would think if there were women there, they would have been mentioned. I'm just throwing that out as, that's,
They
Well,
didn't mention
I
women.
think the authors would say
but
that
this is
the
quite a
women
few
were
women.
probably there. The women probably were
Okay.
there, but that it's again a male patriarchal society, and so they're not.
Yeah, but it's not like one or two, it's like.
Yeah.
Maybe
Oh, yeah.
half a dozen or something.
Yeah, well, there's Mary,
Who's
Mary, and
gonna
Mary.
fix the
yeah.
food for y'all?
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
Somebody's got to mind the stew, right?
They had to have a traveling kitchen, so.
That's what they did during, all the wars. They would have women out there cooking while the guys.
No,
were out.
I understand all that, but it just, when you think about Jesus traveling and going up to the mount, all of it, telling the disciples to stay awake, there's no mention of them there.
Probably weren't.
Probably
No.
more.
Well, the authors would respond by saying the fact that the women in the background throughout the entire story suddenly emerge as the true disciples, perhaps marks most radical social reversal.
They were the ones listening. And
So he's
wasn't falling on deaf
he's
ears.
suggesting that the women were there, and I mean our authors.
And
So
think
that-
about that. That's kind of interesting. When I've heard about more modern church, it's the church women who keep it moving. And the guys are home reading the Sunday paper and the sports page. No, seriously, I'm not you, but I gotta go home.
We don't read the
No,
sports page.
you guys, I'm just saying, my father said that there were
Yeah.
maybe one or two men at his home congregation, and it was the women's department, whatever, that was doing a lot of the work.
Well, even when I think back on my youth, basically a long time ago, there were, women had the women's department. They also handled the music, the organ, the choirs.
Sunday school.
Every time there was a potluck, it was the women who brought the food, not the men. It very few men were brought in food for a potluck. It was always the women putting it together.
Like she said,
So-
Sunday school.
Yeah, Sunday school, exactly. So, yeah, it's, has always been the women and men stand up front and preach. So anyhow, here's another picture of the three Marys, or two Marys and Salome at the
We had a square door and a round stone.
Well, it's an artist's interpretation. Okay, Mark 16, 1-4. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Mary, and I inserted Mary Salome because some versions do say Mary Salome, brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?
Well, that's why they drew it circular one.
Yeah, so I think it had to be certain to roll with. And the authors state, and I'd like to get your reaction to this, it says, cruelly, even the therapeutic ritual of weeping over Jesus' corpse and mustering brave eulogies is denied. The entrance to the makeshift tomb is sealed shut by a boulder that was very large. So what do you think they're referring to? They talk about therapeutic ritual, brave eulogies. What are they talking about?
One was cleaning the body and anointing it. And, I'm sure they had certain prayers that they said.
I think in Judaism, the morning somebody passes actually goes on for almost a year. There's a lot of rituals and things that are done.
Yeah.
And probably none of that happened to Jesus. Of course, we've only had 3 days. But
Now, what did happen with Jesus?
He wasn't there.
Simon.
No, I mean, what happened with Joseph of Arimathea? What did he do?
He gave him the tomb.
Pardon?
He gave it was his tomb.
Okay.
He wrapped him in the terrain cloth.
In linen cloth. Yeah. Well, if you take a look at first century Palestinian burial practices, as soon as the death was certain, the deceased eyes were closed, the corpse was washed, wrapped in strips of cloth and bound. Men could prepare the corpse of a man, but could prepare either. And so it's appropriate that just as appropriate that women go there. In fact, the authors even make reference to kind of a charitable group of women who go and basically perform the burial rites and the wrapping and all that sort of thing, washing of perfume of men who had been crucified because they typically would not have a family come to claim the body. Perfumes or ointments were used for the washing. It's prepared, then the male relatives and friends would carry the corpse in a procession, accompanied by neighbors and friends. And the procession typically went from the home where the person had died to the family tomb, and immediate family would place the body in the tomb. Friends would wait outside, and often there were personal effects that were buried with personal sandals, coins, things of that sort, jewelry, etc. So that's what they're talking about. That whole process was skipped for Jesus. The author suggests that Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus' body in linen and sealed it in the tomb unceremoniously, while the women went to anoint the corpse with perfume and properly prepare the for burial. Their approach, the author's approach, is Joseph just simply took it, threw the body in, wrapped it, and then threw it in, and that was it. And there was no process. Comments? Does it make a difference? Is that how you view Joseph in the past?
I guess my always thinking on his part was that he was trying to protect Jesus' body from being taken, that he was considered a rebel, and as they do, they don't want a big thing made about it, and do something to the body in a bad way. So I've always assumed that's why it was a big rock. It was a rock that was big. It was hard to move away. It was more of a protection thing.
A lot of the tombs of that time period, you find that there are not doors to it. They're simple. Well, it's a door, but it's not. There's nothing blocking.
Well, it was a cave. Yeah. What he had.
Any other comments?
That might be why the women, if they weren't nearby.
Well, I know there are some scholars that would say that the Romans would not have even afforded them the opportunity to take the body and bury it. That just wasn't how it was done with crucifixion, because they were being punished. If they did give Joseph the body, then maybe because he was a person of influence, maybe he felt like he better get him into the tomb while the opportunity was there.
Well, I mean, I've always, the authors talk about him as being a member of the Sanhedrin, which could be. I'm not sure. I recall scripturally where that indicates, but he certainly was somebody of authority to be able to go. I would say, Matthew. I'm not sure I agree. Every impression I've had of Joseph has been that he was trying to protect him. I didn't get him wrapping it, throwing it in the tomb as being unceremonious or sacrilegious. Again, I thought the authors try to contrast Joseph with the women who going actually go through the burial process. Like so many scenes, again, this is a quote from the authors. Like so many scenes from the Gospels, this one has been all too romanticized by the church. It would have been a risky act for those who demonstrate solidarity with so notorious a political dissident. Any reactions to that?
Well, the disciples were in hiding by this time, but the women, I think, could get by with it because they were carrying out the ceremony, where, could or could not have been considered political affront. But the men, if they had come, then I think it would have been definitely.
On the one hand, I can see, in that time period, women were valued and noticed less. So I can see how they would fit. On the other hand, I think the authors are saying it still was a risky act because Jesus was condemned to death by Pilate for insurrection. And so he was, in essence, a terrorist. And to go and be associated with that could be risky for them. We do have a romanticized that point. We talk about sun rising, finding an angel there, and talk about what it's saying. But we do romanticize that view. Is that good or bad? Other comments?
It does say that Joseph was a Sanhedrin and was able to take the body because he didn't want hanging on the cross overnight.
That in which gospel is that in?
Yeah, I haven't found it. Part. But it also said that he wished to prevent thereby offending Jewish law, which allowed only a disgraceful burial to be executed without use. Thought it said weird Bible, but no. It said Mark, exact chapter we're on, but not anywhere else. Oh wait, Matthew described him as a simple rich man,
I don't recall.
a respected member of the council, which is Sanhedrin. Luke 23 adds, he had no consent to their decisions or actions,
Okay.
and he was a secret cult.
So the authors go on, and here's another rocky circular rock in the left in the entrance. The stone blocking their way. This the authors state. This stone blocking their way terminates, without explanation, the discipleship journey. Do you agree with that much? How would you have felt that morning if you were discipled? There's a stone in front of you. Goes on to say, what an abrupt and bitter closure to the story. But there's one more scene in Mark's gospel, and upon it hinges the possibility of the Christian church. Why does the possibility of the Christian church hinge upon that one more scene?
Whether whether they believed what he predicted would happen, that he rose from the grave,
okay,
and ascended to heaven.
Okay. So the resurrection is essential. Okay. Arlene, how would you like
to? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told.
Okay. It doesn't say an angel. It says a young man dressed in white robe. What's the significance of the white robe?
Angelic or
okay.
Purity.
Okay, purity. Anything else?
Well, the authors kind of made a deal of this in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested and the young man dropped his robe and ran away naked. And they kind of tied the two events together, which I'd never thought of before, but I don't know that it was necessarily the same robe, but they kind of implied that maybe symbolically at least.
The same young man.
Yeah, same young man.
And I'll cover this a little bit more later, but let's cover it now anyhow, because it's appropriate. Amy Jill Levine talks about the rich young man, and she speculates that the rich young man turned away because he couldn't give up all his riches. Later changed his mind, repented, and came and was among the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was the young man who had then gone from riches down to a single robe, ran away naked. And there's yet another interpretation that we'll talk about.
So how did, I mean, whoever the individual was, but if he was that person, how would you have this information tell to the women?
Good question. Or is
How would
he
have gotten
symbolic?
inside?
Mhm.
And how would he have gotten inside the stone?
Yeah. Or are we interpreting that white robe as meaning it's an angel?
Well, that's other gospels developed it into that. Said that there was an angel.
Excuse me. But Mark is the earliest gospel and doesn't refer to an angel. The other thing is down here, why does it say, go tell his disciples and Peter? Why does he single out Peter?
I think because Peter had denied him 3 times and he was probably feeling the remorse that he, did that they wanted to make sure that Peter was told.
Hadn't Peter gone back to fishing? He had left the group, but we're
So you think it's reaching out to Peter to say, even though you've denied me 3 times, go meet me in Galilee.
Well, I mean, the other gospels, at least one of the other gospels, I think when the women bring the information back, Peter is the first one to run to the tomb. So he must have still been, I mean, according to Matthew or Luke or somebody, he must have still been there. Right. But maybe the emphasis is on Peter specifically because of, what happened with him and the denial.
Yeah. Well, that's another conundrum, because if he's gone fishing, why is he so handy to be able to reach? But again, the stories between the 3 gospels,
get muddy.
yeah, do good. So here's the mysterious young man. The authors say the young man, symbol of the transformation from betrayal, nakedness, to discipleship, white robe, has issued the 3rd call to discipleship, and they have winners. It is a prospect the women, the reader, never considered. Now, what's interesting, we're going to talk about the 3rd call to discipleship and figure out what the first 2 were. But it's interesting that I was listening to, I don't know if Paul, if he was into the Bart Ehrman podcast or video thing this weekend.
No, I haven't listened to it yet.
Well, one of the speakers was talking about in our society, there are certain phrases, and I wish I could remember what they were, that evoke memories, that things that we, like if I talk to you about the Beatles, I'm not talking about bugs, more than likely. And there are other terms that we reference right away. And they're saying, this scholar is saying, that many of the symbols in Mark were things that evoked an automatic recollection or memory for the people. The white robe of the young man evokes memories of the apocryphal revelation and the martyrs. The martyrs in the end are dressed all in white robes. The other thing is that Joseph of Arimathea putting Christ in linen. Linen was typically the fabric that was used for burial. It wasn't like I'm going to wear a linen dress today or a linen suit. It was like that was burial cloth. And so the young, when Christ is put there, it's a burial thing. The white of the robe here also refers to kind of a burial linen. In fact, the word used for Christ's linen and this white robe in the Hebrew is the same. Okay, so there's some association there, some symbol saying that this is related to death and resurrection.
That's a good point, because the story has been told and retold many times over the 40 years from the death of Jesus to Mark writing the gospel. Which is probably where Mark got, the information. I think about that every year when we get together for our Christmas vesper and we read the same scripture, and we always know what's coming.
Yeah.
Or Easter, we always know what the next thing is going to be, and yet we like to hear that story. But it's very familiar, and this would have been very familiar to the people who heard it in Mark's time, probably.
So at least the authors are making the case for the fact that the young man is the same that was in the Garden of Gethsemane, who flees in betrayal, and his nakedness is a sign of that betrayal, and yet ends up being the one that Christ sees first, that sees the risen Lord first. And I put this question about what does Amy Jill Levine suggest? Well, if you put the three together, conceivably, symbolically, you have the rich young man who can't give up his riches, and later on decides that, yeah, I'm going to change my lifestyle. I'm going to follow the way of this Jesus, and becomes a disciple in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then runs away, but then also becomes the very first person that sees Jesus.
So all these years we've been saying the women saw Jesus first, and now you're saying that's not true.
That's what the authors are suggesting. And again, it's symbolic. And what is symbolic? It's that we can reject our call to discipleship, try again, and even fail again, and then still be followed the way, be part of the discipleship. So I like that symbol.
That is kind of an interesting symbol.
Well, maybe the young man, if he was kind of hanging around in the background and saw I know Mark didn't have that, but the exchange between Jesus and the thieves on either side when he was crucified, and saw the one thief forgiven, and even at the last minute had a second chance, maybe thought that maybe there's a chance for me too.
So
Question though,
yes.
on some of the versions in the other gospels, weren't the women shocked to see this angel or whatever this man was that was there? Well, if one of the women was Mary Magdalene, that we all assume, then she would have known that guy if he had come and started hanging around with Jesus. She would have known him if he had become a disciple and
Okay.
was there.
Another
And this
conundrum.
indicates that they didn't know him.
Well, it doesn't really say they didn't know him.
Well, I'm thinking in more the other gospels.
Yeah.
Well, that was the ones that described it as an angel, not just a guy in a white.
Yeah, I think I didn't go back to double check, but I think the other gospels primarily to the personage as an angelic nature. So, but again, it's you're getting 3-4 stories
Right.
from 4 different sources, their perspective on what happened. Sometimes it's hard to coordinate that all. So the authors say that was the third call to discipleship. What was the first call to discipleship? You all know this. Guys are out there fishing in the boat.
Jesus calls the fishermen.
Yeah.
Follow him.
So Jesus first called to discipleship, invited people to leave their places in the prevailing social and economic order and to follow him in reclaiming the vision of Jubilee and God's sovereignty. Now that's the author speaking, and you can tell that they're coming again from this social justice standpoint, that people are on the fringes of society are called to follow Jesus and ignore the center core of the society, which is more capitalistic or power. So the specific verse is Mark 1:17 says, "Come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people," or make you fishers, depending on which version of the Bible. So what's the second call to discipleship? First one is follow me. What's the second one? This is your final exam, by the way.
Go and do.
It's been really gonna be a pop quiz.
Okay.
And he called them to go and do likewise.
Okay. And specifically, second call articulates the political consequences of that practice. So it is going to likewise, but it's also be prepared for the consequences of making bad kind of a choice. Excuse me. Mark, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So it's not just follow me, but take up my cross, your cross, and follow me. So what's the third call to discipleship? This is all according to the authors.
To believe that God, or that Jesus rose from the grave, ascended to heaven.
Okay, and what does that cause us to do? Follow him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So we're told to go forth, to go and follow him, to follow the way. In Easter's first flight, Mark's story ends as it began. He is going before you. Behold, I send my messenger before you, and you will construct the way. So in other words, the Gospel of Mark starts with this phrase in the second verse that says, "Behold, I send my messenger before you, construct the way." And then it ends with saying, "He's going before you." So the third call is to follow the way, follow Jesus, and to follow the way. That makes sense? So then the end of the story, Mark 16:8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
So they didn't do what the young man said to do. The told disciples.
Yeah. But how do we know about it then?
With the diaries.
We read their diaries.
Paul
Okay.
Harvey, the rest of the story.
Yeah. Well, it's
Well,
interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't the road to Emmaus, isn't that where Jesus comes upon the two disciples?
Okay, but we're focusing just on Mark. This is the end of Mark.
Is that not Mark? Okay. I was just, because he went to Galilee, so the disciples saw him and then he disappeared.
We're
I thought that was it.
going to go into more detail on that in a second. But I want the authors are saying the narrative strategy. I can't talk this morning. The narrative basically says that they said nothing, has something else in mind. The genius of this incomplete ending, like a painting lacking the finishing stroke, is that it demands a response from its audience. So they're speculating that the story ends there for Mark because he wants us to do something. He wants us to feel on edge. Have you ever watched a movie and you get to the very end and it doesn't quite satisfy what you really want to know and it irritates the heck out of it?
Well, a lot of people said that about Jesus Christ Superstar because it gets through the crucifixion and there's nothing about Easter.
Yeah.
It
My
just,
mother was furious.
it
about
just, yeah, it just stops. But people know the rest of the story, like you say, the Paul Harvey part of it. So I guess they want us to imagine, what happens next.
So it's that unfinished ending that causes us to want to do something, to finish it, to wrap it up somehow or other. And so that's the end of Mark,
Okay.
except, well, let's go with this. The authors go further to say, for it is at the point of failure and disillusionment that the invitation comes again. So in other words, the disciples have failed, they are disillusioned, they have not done what they thought they would do. Then come our discipleship journey either truly ends or truly begins. So they're saying symbolically, Mark ends it at that point because it leaves it up to us. We're either going to follow Christ or we're not. We're either going to believe or we're not.
Okay.
And the end of the story continued. Jesus is risen. This is again the author's statement. But where has he gone? He is neither entombed, as the Romans think, nor enthroned, as the longer endings imagine. So what are the longer endings?
Well, I didn't read the little fine print with my glasses off, but it says the most reliable early manuscripts from Mark did not include Mark 16:9-20, and that's the part I had read last night.
So there is a longer ending. And the earliest Markian manuscripts end where we ended it there.
Right there.
And with a shorter version. And the authors go on to say that Mark refuses to show him to us. If we wish to see Jesus, we too must journey to Galilee. Jesus has gone on ahead of the church. Only by responding to the invitation to discipleship can we join him where he already is, on the way. So that's the author's view of why it ends at that point. That Mark is trying to challenge us with that unfinished, unsettled ending. Now, does that ending include the resurrection? Is the tomb empty or is it full? It's empty. So there is a resurrection.
Mhm.
It's just Mark doesn't, in the original version, does not go further to give us the rest of the story.
Well, you're assuming that there was a resurrection, but all we know is that the tomb is empty, right?
Well, but what does it say?
In the first Mark.
What does the young man in white linen say? He
But that's
says,
the added part, isn't it?
No,
no,
that's
Oh, I
not.
thought it was.
no.
That's
That's where it ends.
That's
Oh,
where-
okay.
He tells them
He was
go
risen.
to Galilee. He doesn't say he's risen, but he says go to Galilee. He will meet you
Yeah.
there.
I thought he
They
said,
were looking for Jesus.
back to this thing.
He's
I
risen,
thought it
he is
said
not here.
he told him he is risen.
That's
He has gone ahead to Galilee. There you will see him, and just as he told you.
okay. It doesn't technically say he is risen, but he said,
Go
Yeah.
on back.
well,
No, it does.
he is
Go
going
on
ahead
back.
of you.
Go on back.
One
Go
more?
one more back. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who is crucified. He has risen.
Okay. I take it back.
I know, I read it.
Okay.
He
You
is
got
not
it.
here.
I was focusing more on the fact that
He is not
he's
here.
gone ahead, which implies resurrection, but doesn't
Right.
specifically say it, but you're right. I get to be right. I get to be wrong once in each class. So now let's skip ahead. Excuse me.
No.
Oh, so the part that was added was the disciples actually seeing Jesus.
That's the road to Emmaus, right?
Here's verse 9, some version. And I don't know if I finished saying this or not. The earliest manuscripts are 300 years, in basically 300 BC. They do not include verse 9. Okay. This is, in some versions, it says, then goes on to say, then they quickly reported all these instructions to those around Peter. After this, Jesus himself also sent out through them from east to west the sacred, perishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. Now, that doesn't sound, the language doesn't sound a lot like Mark. And most Bible scholars, that was added later on. But that's the shorter of the longer two versions.
It is, yeah.
And so here's the longer
The
of
one
the
I've got.
two, which we don't really have time to read the whole thing. We're running out of time. But basically, it says that he appeared to Mary Magdalene. She went and told the others, weeping and mourning. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in different form to two of them while they were on the walking country. They returned and reported it. Jesus later appeared to 11 as they were eating. He said, go, and here's the Great Commission, which, by the way, does appear in all the other Gospels. Go into all the world and preach, and including the book of Acts. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized with disciples, etc., etc. After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up in heaven and sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, etc. So this is the longest of the longer versions and goes into more detail, but basically most scholars believe it was added at a little bit. So the question then is, how do we respond? If we are honest, we will admit the cross is so intimidating, blindness so pervasive, and all we can do is say we believe, help us God. I think I already talked about that. So I have 3 questions, none of which we have time to talk about today. But you might think about what you've learned in our study of the gospel. And if you have any open questions, and Paul's teaching next week. So if you have any open questions, just ask Paul. And you know, I'm curious if your view of Mark has changed over the course of stuff. But again, we're up to the deadline. So as a quick, short response to any of those.
It's interesting how, these authors had an agenda, and we've read other books on the Gospels where they've had a specific agenda. I'm thinking primarily the one that talked about the conflict in the early church, and everything that author introduced, spoke to that. And so I think it's nice to know what the biases are when we read these books, because then you can kind of begin to say, well, okay, this is what the authors think. But, is that what I think that this is? It's kind of nice to have that as a contrast, I guess.
Well, I think their opinions, while good and good intention, I think sometimes it was a stretch for me to, I appreciate what they're trying to do, but at times I thought it was a stretch, trying to make it work always. Some places, yeah, it had some good points.
Well, I personally enjoyed going through and going literally verse by verse and analyzing it. And it's also interesting to take Mark and the gospel separate from the other, find out how much it's not in the others. What's interesting is Mark is the shortest gospel and it's also the first. And so it's kind of like Paul writing a short story and my saying, I can do it better. I think I can have it. I remember before, so I had back guys, I can add
Guys.
more. I know more than so.
Well, and they say historically Matthew and Luke had another source, the Q source, that wasn't Mark. Right. So somebody else had a story that maybe had been written down and lost to history, which is kind of interesting. But you think about all the pockets of Christianity that had popped up. All the way from Jerusalem to Rome, and all the parts throughout Turkey and Asia Minor. Everybody probably has their own story.
Yeah, exactly.
Develop their own thinking about it.
Okay, well, thank you.
There's a little note here that said the reason that Peter was singled out was because that was how they restated him.
And we're just doing the introduction next week. Right?
Yes,
So it's new book.